All right, let's begin with that. Let's go from that to Mike Foale, who's looking longingly, kind of wishing he was up there, I think. Mike, why don't you talk a little bit about some of the specifics of how you could envision the space station being utilized in the future?
Well, Miles, you gave me 10 minutes, and I just want to make sure that people know a little bit of the context. I'm an active astronaut today. I represent the astronaut office, and have to be careful what I commit my colleagues to or not doing when I talk here behind this panel. My mother's, just for those of you who don't know me, my British accent's, it's all right, I'm an authenticated American. I'm not House, I'm not Hugh Laurie. My mum's American. Mom. My first flight, I've flown 5 times on the space shuttle, 1 time on a Soyuz rocket. On the times that I've flown on the shuttle, the first 2 flights were scientific missions, independent of a space station, observing the Earth from space. It was the Atlas I and Atlas II series of missions on STS-45 and 56. Happened to be with Charlie Bolden, my commander, my first commander. He was a wonderful commander. He told me to get a will. Now, I want to make that point seriously. He told me to get a will, and none of us had wills of the new guys. We are dealing with a risky business, and I thank him for the advice. That said, I flew 5 times on the space shuttle and then 1 more time on a Soyuz rocket. Those science missions were important, but of course we were even then looking towards the space station. In 1997, I had a great adventure, which was to be launched to the Mir space station. And I was launched on a space shuttle that took me in a model which we're going to use, I think, a lot today, which was the taxi model. That is, there were 7 crew members, and I was the 7th, and I was delivered to a space station. And then the space shuttle left, STS-84 left, and left me on the space station, Mir, not without a ride home, I should add, but at least my planned time home was dependent on the next ride coming up. On the Mir, I did some science, but it was interrupted by a series of unfortunate events on the Mir stations, and it was probably the lowest point in the Russian space program that I've had any experience with. Since then, when a cargo ship collided with the Mir station. Since then, the Russians have been extraordinarily reliable partners, and we, as a result of that collision, I think, paid a lot more attention to what Russia was doing in its program. And so today, they do represent the United States method for getting astronauts to the International Space Station in a model which I would call the rental car model, whereby the astronauts and cosmonauts that are going to the space station are on the vehicle that they would come home in. They're not waiting to be picked up. When I went to the International Space Station as the commander in 2003, 2004, I went with only 6 months of training on that Soyuz vehicle, because up to that point I'd intended to go on the space shuttle, and we had Columbia. Columbia occurred, and we were rapidly redirected, all of us, to recover from that accident. And my part in it was to sustain space station operations post-Columbia on the International Space Station with 1 other crew member, 1 other person, Alexander Kaleri. I have a general theme here, which is the more people on the space station, the more I think we will get out of it. I think interaction in general with a fairly large number of people on the station is quite realistic. If there are psychologists here saying there's a problem, in general, I've always had the most positive experiences with the larger crews, and with 2 people, it was rather hard going for 6 months. On the space station, at that time, in 2004, we had 1 visiting vehicle. That was a progress. It came around about Christmas. This year, about 20 vehicles are going to visit the International Space Station. So when he says 500 people in a week, we have a serious parking problem. I mean, the traffic model does need to increase, and it's critical that traffic model of once every 6 months that the astronaut office thinks of is thrown away. We need to have a much more frequent traffic model going to the International Space Station. I think there are lots of ways There's lots of reasons why that could come to pass. The other thing about my most recent experience was that with the Columbia down, with the shuttle system down, the United States had this incredible investment in space, extraordinary amount of money, and yet we didn't have access to it without reverting to or resorting to a parallel path to low Earth orbit, which was the Russians. And that parallel path is key to, I think, the direction that we're hearing today in the President's proposal to enable commercial spaceflight to low Earth orbit. We need a redundant and parallel path as a nation to get to our investment in space. That would be true even if we were trying to go to the moon, and even if we were trying to go beyond the moon to Mars, or to, for example, an L1 propellant depot. Either way, you need, if you're going to put a lot of money into an object in space that you need to get to, you need to have two ways to get there, at least. That said, with a strong Russian partner and a US national launch system, we meet the requirements, I believe, of parallel path to get to our investment. But when the space shuttle is retired, we are now we're in a difficult position, and the Russians are in a difficult position. They are the only path to the International Space Station. And they won't be as happy with that situation, really, as we are. Any happier, I mean. So the point I'm making here is it's very important that the commercial crew efforts to get astronauts to space station happen soon. And I have had the privilege to take part in assessing the NASA commercial needs for getting crew to space station and to low Earth orbit. And my mantra in all of those assessments was soon. The sooner you can achieve this, the better. This commercial effort also will fail, in my mind, if it only produces one successful provider of launch services. There needs to be more than one provider of launch services for the United States to low Earth orbit, if it's really a success. Because then it does make the United States independent of another nation's capability. Or you invite more nations into the International Space Station and your projects to make those parallel paths. So there's two ways to do it for the United States. One is to create more than one provider in the US, or have more partners, international partners. Science on the station. I really enjoy science. I'm a physicist, astrophysicist. I did a set of experiments on the space station that I found very interesting. About 72 experiments were taking place while I was there. Only about 3 or 4 of them really involved me directly. 2 of us were on the station, and I was spending about a quarter of my time, at the most, doing science on the space station. Today, with a 6-person crew, a much larger fraction, I think, is spent of the total crew time on science, and should be spent on science. But then, we were sustaining station operations, and we needed experiments, but we didn't have any way to launch them. And I think in the end, the 8 kilometers a second that you need to get into low Earth orbit is the key, and is the barrier, and is the problem to all of the things that we're addressing today. And this shift to commercial crew is all about getting that 8 kilometers a second for your payloads, for your experiments, for the ticket buyers, for the propellant depot in L1. It's all about overcoming that 8 kilometer per second energy problem, which is how much energy you need to get a person into space, or a kilogram into space. I think it's fantastic that the ISS is going to go to 2020. The ISS is going to be used for, I'm going to just roll them off. Robotics is one thing which the ISS is developing that is often missed out when we line up the technologies that are being discussed and the experiments being done. Robotics, actually, the assembly of the US segment of the International Space Station is extraordinary when you think about it. Using the Canadian robotic arm, there's also the Canadian Dexter, the fine manipulator, and there's also a Japanese arm. But robotics in general turns out to be a really enabling thing on the International Space Station in its construction. But I think if it goes further towards propellant transfer and to the enabling of propellant depots beyond low Earth orbit, if that turns out to be a good way to go beyond low Earth orbit, there may be some cool propellant solutions out there that don't need that, but the way I see it is we will need propellant depot. I'm going to talk about what I'd like to see in space now. I think the greatest thing that's been done by the International Space Station is the partnership with internationals. And I think yes, there's bureaucracy, yes, there's difficulty in language and interaction, but an international partnership ends up being the most sustainable program for a nation. Would it be easy to cancel Constellation if it was international? I don't believe so. The space station has been right on one vote for cancellation, but international helped sustain it. And in the end, international helped us get over the period when we lost our national launch capability. So I think international partnerships should be continued and developed for the International Space Station in its increasing access. Parallel redundant access I've mentioned. I think more people should be sent to the station. Let me give you an idea. From an astronaut's point of view, my astronaut colleagues say, well, how will I fly to the station if we're going once every 6 months, there's only 3 persons, possibly 4 persons per year out of the astronaut office, there's no career. Not true if you go right back to what we thought we should do with the station, which is launch every 3 months. Or indeed, we launch a taxi model, which could be carrying not just 3 people or 4 people to the station, but 7 people to the station. And the other 3 or 4 seats are occupied by people who are coming to set up their experiments, tear them down. They come to visit for as long as that vehicle wants to stay at the station. If it happens to be the lifeboat, it will stay. If there's a lifeboat already at the station for assured return, then the taxi can return and be used again for another flight and increase the traffic model of the provider so that their business case is better. So I think the key to the station is getting more, and the type, it could be, and I'll talk about National Lab. I think National Institutes of Health. I think DARPA could have its own section. There are reasons why you can't do military and defense-oriented projects on the International Space Station because it's an international space station. But there's no reason why, and we do commercial, proprietary experiments and activities on the space station. And we've already taken part of that, and some of those products are already in the market in terms of protein crystal growth and other samples. So I think data protection, I think commercial and proprietary operations on the station are all things that are in the future and can be done with a larger seat and load factor to the station than we have currently on the Soyuz. And I should point out that the Soyuz is the only vehicle that carries people to the station to live there. The shuttle visits, but it doesn't leave anybody there anymore. We had the last one was, I think, Nicole Stott last year. And finally, I'd like to say I don't think space station should ever be deorbited. And that's not just a whim. If Franklin Chang Diaz is an astronaut who I know well, who is a visionary. He was a fusion physicist originally, but has taken his skills, he's from MIT, to develop a plasma rocket. And there are other ways to get what's called high ISP thrust out of an engine. But he has a system, and it's a fairly well-developed engine that produces very low thrust, but for a very, very, very long duration at a very, very, very high efficiency. And it needs electrical power. And I believe there's a technology program to put, as one of the new technology programs, to put that on the International Space Station. That sort of system can get you to Mars in about 4 to 6 weeks. I did the original calculations for Franklin back in the late 80s and early 90s. That system can get you to Mars in 4 to 6 weeks, spiraling out, accelerating continuously, and then halfway, still spiraling, decelerating, it gets you into Mars. That's how you stop the damage of radiation, for example, between and out of the Earth's magnetosphere, between Earth and Mars. So if you get short travel times to Mars, short travel times to asteroids, now you can hide behind your celestial body from the sun, from a solar storm. Now you can hide from the galactic cosmic rays if you have materials at hand. And so the key there is the space station needs to be used for propulsion and out of low Earth orbit exploration development. Those are, so that same engine could be used to boost the station. And it's part of the demonstration of showing that the Vasimir, as he calls it, works on the International Space Station in the next 2 or 3 years. It should be and could be and be planned to lift the station eventually out of the low Earth orbit that it's in now, when we have decided that our vehicles no longer need to, well, for whatever reason, we can get it higher so that it won't have to be disposed of. It could one day be the tourist side trip or the special government side trip on the way to an L1 propellant tank farm between the Earth and the Moon. I can obviously go on a long time, but I've left the key. We could talk about later on is how would propellant depots meet the needs or sort of provide the market for commercial launch providers. Sorry.
All right. Excellent, Mike. There's lots of things to follow up on there, including I'm curious about the power needs for something like
about 1.5 megawatts was for a vehicle about the size of the shuttle to get to Mars.
So probably something nuclear to make that happen.
Doesn't have to be. Solar Dynamic Power was a solar collector that we were planning to launch on STS-86 to the Mir station. I think it was because of the space station Freedom morphed into ISS, and about that time we changed the power plan from solar arrays from solar dynamic parabolic solar collectors, which are much more efficient, but the technology was still a lower readiness level. And we shifted to a better known one, which was the solar power array. That was really why we dropped that mission to Mir. But that same sort of system could be renovated. In fact, it's highly topical and relevant today, given the approach to solar energy.
All right, let's move it to Tom Pickens. There's an old expression in aviation, I suppose it applies to space, that if you want to make a small fortune, start with a large one. So he's proving that's wrong. Tom, why don't you tell us a little bit about what you're up to?
Let me go back to when I started to get involved in with Space Hab, which has now been renamed as to Astrotech. I took over as CEO in 2007, January of 2007. And we knew that the space shuttle was going to retire. They had made very definite plans to cease providing funding to the supply chain. It was easy to see once you stopped putting a lot of those very integral pieces into the supply chain of the shuttle, it wasn't long before you weren't going to be able to revive it. And they had already told us that they weren't going to fly our Space Hab modules any longer. And we knew that was going to be over in August of '07. So we centralized our efforts over on our satellite processing business called Astrotech Space Operations, and then we made sure that was good and intact and in good order. We had to do some refinancing of the company that was necessary. And then once that was complete, we then shifted over and said, okay, what are we going to do, if anything at all, in looking back at our heritage of sending science primarily for NASA in our Space Hab science modules, and is there any opportunity that we may be able to identify while if we want to stay in context with the company's history. It wasn't a requirement. It wasn't like we were looking to do that. It wasn't like we were making a reason for continuing on in the space program. But we did know that we had some special capabilities, that we had learned a lot, that we had been in the front of over 1,000 experiments have flown in our Space Hab modules, and that we should have eminent knowledge on certain aspects of it, that we would at least know where to point ourselves into the direction to, or we would be easily available to us to go and get and garnish the information that was necessary in order to determine if there was a commercial application or not. So we went to work, and we spent a good and fair amount of time looking at most of the experiments. I won't say all of them, because there's been a whole lot done, especially if you include the Russians' experiments as well over the many, many years of starting off at Apollo. But we went and we looked at them, and we quickly determined that the most valuable thing that you could send to space, because of its lightweight nature and its high value, would be into something that had to do with biotech. And there were really two areas that were available or had done some basic science, and the work had come to some certain conclusions. One of them was microbes. When they sent the first microbes to space, there was actually a conversation that was had between the astronauts and JSC that said, wow, is this dangerous? Because these things are growing way beyond what we were told they were supposed to be growing, much faster, much bigger, and we're concerned. And after some give and take back with the scientists, JSC reported back and said, no, the hardware is a good hardware and it will keep you safe. But it was an indication that they had no idea what they were going to find, and when they did, it was surprising to them. So what you can do with that is you can take microbes and you can send them up, we have found now, and in microgravity they do grow huge. There are some theories as to why. I think that I'm probably satisfied with the idea that it's a phenomena. I'm not sure I believe in any of the theories thus far, but I do know that it is a physiological change with the growth of microbes. And when you bring them back and you analyze them, they show certain elevated levels of virulence or strength. And that gives the scientists a very definite area to go look at when they start creating vaccines. It's to kind of put it into perspective of how valuable that might be. A vaccine typically takes from 10 to 15 years of using a process that's called microarray analysis, which is a robotic arm that tries and tries and tries through a trial and error process in trying to figure out the one telephone number out of 100 billion telephone potential numbers that are held within inside of a genome to try to figure out which one controls the strength of it. And like cowpox was to smallpox, cowpox was a lesser degree of smallpox, but you have to control that virulent factor in order to be able to develop the vaccine synthetically. So the problem is that they start off with 100 billion telephone numbers, and they really don't have much of an idea of really where to go. And you try to figure out how to call me when the phone book's 100 billion tall, and it'd take you a long time. And that's why it takes them 10 to 15 years to develop a vaccine. So when you send them to space and they come back, they have a control sample that they do right here at the SLSL here at the Cape. And we have communications with the shuttle, and we are transferring back and forth the environmental conditions that are on shuttle, on orbit, and we're trying to replicate those in an incubator here at the SLSL in real time. And it's the exact same samples that we delivered to NASA that were then took and placed inside of the shuttle mission. And right when it's activated, we activate at exactly the same time, and we try to replicate those two in concert. And then when they bring them back, think about it as that barcode that you always see on CSI, that they're always looking at the DNA barcode, and it comes and it leaps, and this one doesn't down here. And then they say, there you go. And they ended up coming down to where they get a tighter area. Now, let's say that you're not talking about the telephone numbers of the world. You might be thinking about the telephone numbers of the United States. And then they fly again with those, and they genetically, with enzymes, parse out those, and they then fly those up the next time. So the first one we call our survey flights, and the second ones we call our expression flights. And then we start feeding them to a little animal called a C. elegans that the brilliant people in Germany at Max Planck have developed that acts, looks, and operates a lot like you and me, although they're microscopic worms. They can tell whether the immune system is in that worm elevated due to whatever selection of the strain of microbe that they've chosen to express against it. And they also know if it kills it, and that this genetically designed little C. elegans worm is designed to act like you and me. So when they bring them back, then they know now a smaller area. We're getting down to the state of Florida. And then finally we get down to Cocoa Beach, and finally we get to exactly where we are today with the number that we need in order to develop the vaccines. And it's a long process. It takes 4 or 5 missions to do. But before, when NASA would fly science in the previous ways that they would do it, it would be in fits and starts. And it was one of the criticisms that the scientists always brought up as far as NASA and their science, is they weren't consistent and they weren't frequent enough to sustain a good scientific model. We, with NASA's encouragement in this case, because they knew they were completing the station and they knew that it was time that the construction was over with, it was drawing to an end, and these guys have been incredible in terms of what they've done to bend over backwards to put our science on the shuttles, and to just, you have no idea what it's been to get there from, and it's really, it's NASA. I mean, we've done our part. But we were going to do our part anyway. it was NASA this time who said, before, yes, we're in fits and starts, but we were constructing a skyscraper in space. Give us a break. And they were right about that, frankly, in my analysis. And then they said, we're about to complete this. Hey, let's do everything we can in order to fly these as consistently as possible. And we all work together in absolute beautiful harmony. I've never seen anything quite like it in anything I've ever done. And the results are now we have a vaccine that we're moving through FDA for salmonella. And while salmonella is not the most valuable vaccine in the world because it typically doesn't kill people in the developed world, it is a valuable vaccine in the third world. But we did it because there was a lot of previous work that had been done, and that NASA had already flown 2 flights before it, so we had a little head start. But the more important part about salmonella is we knew it was safe. It wasn't going to kill the astronauts if they got it, if it got loose. So we got all of that put down, safety and review at NASA, the hardware, all of our systems, and we now have what we call AMP, which is the Astrogenetic Microgravity Processing Platform, and that's all documented with manuals, and it's got a lot of work that has been done on that. So we now have a proven platform, and now we're sending up MRSA. We're on our 4th flight on orbit right now, I'm excited to say, for MRSA. That kills people. That's a big deal. That's bringing our healthcare system in the hospitals down to their knees. The lawyers are all over it. They're suing hospitals, and they're getting massive, massive judgments on those, and it's not good. And it's not just the United States hospital system either. It's all the developed world, and really the whole world is experiencing the faults of MRSA. Is that staff, that hospital staff is normally called, it is tough stuff. And if we can get a vaccine for that, the very first thing we'll do is we'll try to get the hospital personnel vaccinated, because those are the ones that are the carriers of it. And that's the beginning. Just like in polio, the first thing to do was to go get the healthcare workers and get them vaccinated, and then everything else fell in line after that. So that's the process that we're in. That's what we're doing right now. We chose the microbes because we knew that we only had 2-week sorties to fly them on. You only need about 6 days to process under AMP for these microbes to do their thing. And the PCGs, we feel like you need a lot longer, around 3 months. You have to have sustained microgravity on a quiet station for PCGs, for protein crystals. And it's not quiet. You have Kibo modules coming in and hammering into it, and you have all kinds of things. And we have MRM1 that AstroTech is right now processing, and it'll be slamming into it in May. And so that's not where you want to be growing.
But we can isolate. We do isolate. We do have racks that isolate.
The isolation technology that I've looked at, I've not been particularly impressed with. It has dampening on it, and it has a dampening process that tries to, it tries to somehow or another look at where it's going to have to dampen into, and I'm not impressed with the results of that. Not to say that it's all new. I mean, this is, things that were being done while you were constructing a station.
Yeah, but if an astronaut gets on the treadmill, is that a problem for protein
It is a problem.
crystals?
Yes.
Yeah.
There is a problem, but you can have, like like Mike says, you can put dampening in there,
Right.
but not where you have things slamming into it and it vibrates for 45 minutes and things like that. That does actually happen.
Okay.
That you're trying to get away from.
Well, with 500 people a week, that.
So much for that.
Maybe it's a high-class problem. We'll figure it out. But anyway, let me roll this real quick.
We might need another wing.
Yeah.
Go ahead.
So here we have, real quick, it is a national laboratory, which is a big deal. That allows commercial operations to come into and provide and produce commercial products in space to sell on Earth in a government facility. And there's lots of national labs all over the country, Santia, Los Alamos, there's plenty of them, and now we have one in space at 220 miles up. And advantages of microgravity is growth within the space environment induces valuable changes in microbial cells. That, I'm not going to give excuses as to why, only to tell you it works. Commercial value is that we get the growth rate and size, resistance to drug treatments, and virulence. And then we see vaccines and therapeutics. Now, therapeutics I did not talk a lot about, but that's where you take the vaccines, and then if you have MRSA and you've already got it, now what? And it's these antibiotics that don't work because this thing's always morphing around, and it's such a clever little microbe that it seems to be incredibly infectious, and it certainly looks after itself, that's for sure. Well, we can also move towards and from the vaccines and go into actually a therapeutic that we can apply topographically to the infection, and then it will end up killing the infection, which is super important as well and very valuable. Next slide, please. Here are our flights, and I wanted to put it in that presentation right there to show you what we've been doing and how consistent it is. And again, hats off to everyone I love at NASA. I can't tell you how much I love them. And that's the reason why, is right there. There is the performance of it. And, you know, they've just done a superb job. Here you will see salmonella, salmonella, salmonella. There had already been 2 of them before that. Then we moved off of salmonella and we went on to MRSA. It was our survey flight. All we need is 1 gap, and you'll see what a gap is here in a second, is our piece of hardware. And so we flew a whole lot of others to fill up our pipeline that you see there. By and large, those are infectious diseases. And then we went back to MRSA once we found, you know, as I said, the telephone book of the world, got down to the telephone book of America, and we started flying them and trying to get down to where we are today. And we're very hopeful for the flight that we have on orbit today. Next slide, please. Vaccine targets have been identified. We're moving through FDA. If you know, it's one thing to fly to space. It's another thing to get through FDA. It's amazing. I mean, I know. I mean, I've read things, you know, in financial magazines and things like that talk about how tough it is to get through FDA. But man, when you're in it, whew, it's something else. MRSA virulence targets have been identified and are currently being validated on 131. Next, please. Here's a little movie that shows our...
This is Nicole Stott and CJ Struckout.
That's right. And they're just twisting something that's very low tech in that way, or as I say, it's kind of fail-proof.
I did this on Expedition 8.
Did you?
Yeah.
Then you had probably those first salmonella flights. This is what's going on inside of it. This is how the microbes are eating, and now we introduce the C. elegans in there, and they come in and eat those microbes that are fully developed, and then we bring and we kill them at the end, and then which is perfect, because on re-entry, I don't care how I come in, I don't have to have a safe re-entry. You know, the protein crystals might get shattered. You know, so anyway, next slide, please. And so we have 7 additional microbes that have been conducted and manifested for future flights. Those are the ones that we flew earlier, and we intend to start up again after MRSA. And then the protein crystals, you know, I got to tell you, you know, the microbes are great, and infectious diseases are wonderful, and MRSA I'd love to solve. But when you get into the protein crystals, there's 2 types. There's called an aqueous and a membrane protein. And the aqueous proteins are kind of big, plump, and big. And they're the ones that you're seeing a lot of lead compounds being developed for now. But when you get into the membrane proteins like Parkinson's and Alzheimer's, that's the real stuff. That's really, really hard to do, and you have to have extremely pure crystals in order to get that done. And it's just like a crystal you have in your refrigerator every day, you go in and look at, and it is an ice cube, and it's very cloudy. That's gravity that's having an impact on the formation of those crystals. If you send that same ice cube up to space and grow it, it's perfectly clear, and I think they're perfectly clear. It's the same thing for the crystals that they grow around the proteins. They got to grow the proteins around or grow the crystals around the proteins, and then they refract it with an X-ray, and then they can find what the atoms are, and you got to know exactly what the atoms are in that protein. You can't be off by 1 hydrogen atom, or else you will not be able to connect or control that protein. And you've got to have every advantage to you in that game, every advantage you can imagine, and sending them up to space has already proven to be very advantageous in growing those proteins. And I believe it's the only way that we're going to end up ever solving these more sinister diseases of Parkinson's and Alzheimer's and AIDS and these really, really nasty stuff. They've tried and they've tried and they've tried, and they throw billions of dollars at it, and they haven't got anywhere in those except for maybe treatments. It's a big difference between treatments and cures. So maybe we go to treatments here, but I don't believe that you're going to get there in any other way than flying to space. And the next slide. These are these racks that we have on station. We, in our barter agreement with the international partners, every time we flew a module or a segment, We got half of those racks. As long as they flew in our shuttle, then we got half of the racks or access to them. The U.S. did. We have a lot of racks, and we can fill them up, in my opinion, with a lot of experiments, a lot of basic science that I'm not going to do. I'm going to hopefully expect maybe the NIH to do it, or for NSF to do it, or for the Ag Department to do it, or for the university system to do it. That's what they should do. But they should be filling up those racks, and I should be filling up those racks, and anybody else that has an opportunity should be filling them up too, because it's a magnificent laboratory, and it's ours, and it's completed as of the end of this year. It's super exciting. The most exciting thing I've ever worked on in my life, period.
So the station has a nice rack, huh? Good. That's good. Good to hear. All right. So let's.
Next slide.
Oh, you're still going. I'm sorry.
That's it.
All right.
I just wanted to
All
end
right,
up with making medicines in space to save lives on Earth.
All right. So.
Wow.
Okay. It's just the web, right?
Yeah.
All right. So Brent Alexander you were very instrumental, and I don't know where you're starting off, but I hope you address this. You were very instrumental with the vision for space exploration, which did not turn out the way you expected. I'm curious, how you feel about that and where we are today.
Well, yeah, thank you, Miles. I'm going to talk about how we get to the space station and what the President's proposal, and I think the piece of it that I am most excited about is changing how we get into space. It's changing from government-developed systems to privately developed systems with government safety oversight. And that sounds very mechanical and not very interesting. But what it does is really change the dynamics and the economics of getting into space, such that we have a much more robust capability to not only get more people into space, like Mike was talking about, to the space station, but also to do all the great research that Tom's talking about. And Tom, I know firsthand the value of a salmonella vaccine. My daughter, when she was 4 years old, had salmonella poisoning, and that is a painful, ugly, horrible thing. And so certainly the value for that would be tremendous worldwide. So I thank you for doing that kind of research. So talking about the benefits of this new approach, really I think, looking first, if I could have the next slide please, there are benefits to NASA. I want to move quickly to the benefits to the nation, but the benefits to NASA are freeing up NASA resources for exploration, because focusing on just getting to the space station and using privately developed systems to get there, it's a simpler mission than going beyond. So you free up NASA resources so that NASA can focus on going beyond to the moon, Lagrange points, Mars, moons of Mars, while industry focuses on getting to low Earth orbit and having that redundant access that Mike talked about. Closing the gap. Because it's a simpler mission, it can be done sooner. Not because industry is particularly faster than government, although some may argue that, and I believe that certainly to be true, but the mission is simpler and we can get there faster by just focusing on that. Lower costs and really unlocking the potential of the space station, getting more people and more experiments up there. Next chart, please. The benefits to the nation are, as we do that, we open up a whole new economic system or a whole new economic realm to do all sorts of different things, getting private people into space, private companies into space, and not just government civil servants flying. We're going to have a lot more activity, and it's the private sector that comes up with these innovations and really can drive the economy of this. NASA then, 20, 30 years from now, will be looking back on a system where they are really enabled in their exploration because there's so much other activity in space and it's not all up to the government. It's economic competitiveness, new industries, and a space program for everyone, right? Right now, only government civil servants get to fly in space, and you got to train for a long, long time, and if you apply to the astronaut corps, only the very few and very lucky get to go. Very good and very courageous people. But it's very, very few people. 35 Americans average per year, 5 shuttle flights, 7 people per flight. With the Soyuz, when we get rid of the space shuttle for the Soyuz, we're going to have 6 people going. We're going to be buying 6 seats on Soyuz every year. That really, 49 years after Alan Shepard, John Glenn flew into space, we ought to be flying hundreds and thousands of people every year. And this is the only change I think that'll get us there. Next chart, please. So how are we going to do that? It's a new partnership, but it's not a incredible change from where we've been from an industry standpoint. It is U.S. industry. As the President said this afternoon, U.S. industry has built every spacecraft that Americans have flown on, except for the Russian systems. So American systems have been built by U.S. industry in partnership with NASA. It's a change in that partnership that allows U.S. industry to build capabilities, fly them safely with NASA oversight, and open up these new markets. Systems will be developed, operated, owned by the private sector. They'll meet government needs while enabling new markets, non-government uses, and most importantly, a change in the contractual mechanism from the cost plus sort of typical way we have done business with U.S. industry to change to a firm fixed price sort of, contractual model, the way the normal commercial sector works now. NASA will establish those safety requirements, the program requirements, how many people, how many flights, how much water they take, but also the safety requirements for them. And at the same time, they won't be dictating the specific design. So allowing industry to come up with innovative ways to meet those safety requirements is going to be key. And so NASA will be there every step of the way. It's a big change, and yet it's only a small change in how we do things, but it unlocks the potential for a lot more activity. Next chart, please. So it's really about enabling new markets. If government's going to be the only market forever and ever, then we might as well continue to do things the same way they are now. But what we're really talking about is opening up new markets. Now, those new markets don't exist today, other than very small. It's not going to be in 5 years that commercial is going to dominate, but it's going to be over the next 10, 20, and 30 years that we're going to see this change, much the way we did in aviation. And I'll talk about aviation in a moment. So NASA's going to dominate early on, but those other markets will come. Those other markets include other governments, foreign governments that want to fly people in space. They see the potential of space. They want to unlock that potential for their own purposes. There's national pride involved. They also want to train people. So I think there's a real market there near term for what we would call other sovereign governments. Businesses to exploit microgravity, like Tom was talking about with AstraZeneca. Other pharmaceutical companies, other activities in space. The uses today for the computer are things that we never dreamed about. And when the home computer, the personal computer was introduced in the late 70s, early 80s, we could have never dreamed that we'd have so much computing power in our hands. We take it everywhere and we access the internet all the time. We can't live without these things today. And yet they were unheard of, not even thought of, long after even we had landed on the moon. So everything has changed in some worlds and not much has changed in other markets. And time is now to start here. So the payback then to U.S. leadership in space, to the economy, and to developing better, safer systems to flying astronauts into space. The payoff there, the payback there, will be immeasurable, I believe. Next chart, please. In aviation, this is kind of a messy chart, but aviation really is the analog. The U.S. industry had the lead in aviation. We founded it. The Wright brothers in 1903 were the first to flight. 15 years later, we were well behind the Europeans, French, Germans, in aviation. And it took government enabling that activity to come in to do the things that government does best, invest in R&D, become a customer, and develop and operate things that are specific for needs for the government. For aviation, military aviation, for example, aircraft carriers, for example. That's not necessarily true for spaceflight. There's nothing unique about just getting to space that should be a government-only function forever and ever. It's time to transition that to the private sector. If you look at what the NACA, government involvement in aviation did for aviation, it turned it into a golden era, a golden age of increased rapid development of new systems, new prototypes, people starting to fly and for different purposes. First, in terms of tourists, we had first a lot of rich people flying, kicking off the market for all of us. And today it's ingrained in the global economy in a way that people could not have imagined 100 years ago. We need to do that for space. Next chart, please. And so here's where we are with space. Up until today, we've never flown more than about 50 people a year in the U.S. We need to change that. I think in the post-shuttle era, with private human spaceflight capabilities enabled by NASA, we will end up with thousands and tens of thousands of people flying into space over the next 50 years. We've had 50 years of human spaceflight, and never have we put more than 50 people in space in 1 year, or about 50 people. And so while NASA's activity will greatly increase, I think that's only because private activity will increase even more. And finally, I just want to leave you with the next chart, which just shows a range first before I conclude, let me talk about the direct jobs that will be created by the commercial crew program that's proposed by the President. We recently commissioned a study by an independent outside company called the Tori Group to look at the $6.1 billion that President Obama's budget has in there for commercial crew and cargo activities. We didn't include all sorts of other monies that are in there. We just said, what is this $6.1 billion going to go for, and how many jobs will it create? It's an average of 11,800 jobs every year for the next 5 years. Now, that's not additive. That's roughly 12,000 jobs that are going to be there for that 5-year period based on this funding. A lot of those jobs, about 25% of that money, $1.3 to $1.5 billion of that, is directly related to launch activities. It's launch infrastructure. It's building launch vehicles. It's the launch operations. A large chunk of that $1.5 billion is going to happen right here at the Cape. And so 25% of the money related to launch, a huge chunk of those jobs will also be right here at the Cape. And of course, Florida can get a lot more of that activity if it branches out into other parts of manufacturing and processing and assembly of vehicles. So these are very important numbers. I think they're very robust, and I think the rigor, the analytical rigor behind them is tremendous, and they really are well sourced. Next chart. So I just want to leave you with this, that there's a lot of that can happen because of commercial crew. It's a good program. It changes everything over time, and the time is now. So thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Brent. All right. Everyone, I certainly want to encourage any questions or comments from the crowd. So if you have somebody, just start raising your hand. We're going to get a microphone to you. Oh, you have one right away? Yeah, okay. No, I'm sorry. I misunderstood. So Mike Foale, let's talk a little bit about the vision here. First of all, going back to what the President said today, and this had leaked out a couple of days ago, but this notion of building a crew lifeboat, Orion Light is the term. What do you think of that idea, and what is its potential?
It was a very relevant and, in fact, important announcement. Recognition, I think, is the way to put it. The way the National Office, when they were assessing the transition to commercial crew and what it meant for the NASA government astronaut employee, we had a long discussion internally about, should there be a government vehicle at all times to take us to the International Space Station. I personally believe that having a government launch system and funded in the normal, traditional contractual way would be a competition to the commercial enterprise that you're trying to foster. So I didn't see that as being particularly positive.
But is that fair competition, do you think?
I think what they've recently announced is that the Orion spacecraft will actually just be a return vehicle. So it won't be taking people up. It'll be there as a lifeboat for several years at a time and doesn't present competition to the commercial side. And in fact, it's actually a good thing for the commercial side because it gets those entities out of the day-to-day continual operation of the station. They're not an integral function of the station 24/7, 365 days a year for years on end. It's really all about they will be operational only in those 1 week or 2 week long trips that they make up. So I think it's a good thing both for commercial crew program and the way it's being designed, as well as a necessary component of the space.
Well, finish your point.
So my point here is I was pleased that the investment in the Orion vehicle as a deep space vehicle was not going to be thrown away. And I'm thinking of its solar arrays, I'm thinking of its thermal systems, I'm thinking of its ability to leave low Earth orbit. And if some of that is left in the project, and we come to the the point that the astronaut office came to, which was we do need a seat to come home from the International Space Station for all visitors and permanent crew, because we can, since we're in low Earth orbit. If you think of yourself as a ship that's sinking, the lifeboats don't take you to America or to Europe. They hang around until you get picked up. That's what the lifeboats do. But in this case, we're being told there's going to be a lifeboat that can take us all the way home. And that's because we think we can. Morally, I think there's a reason to justify it. Given that you have that lifeboat capability now, part of the President's plan, it does mean that the commercial entities, and I would mention Boeing, for example, SpaceX, those are two other entities that are bidding on commercial, well, not bidding yet, but they're interested in commercial services. They could also offer to provide the lifeboat function. And I just have to hope that that is not in competition with, or the government is not competing with those offers. So that has to work itself out. The deep space part of the Orion vehicle is very, very interesting to me. And indeed, of course, I believe the Lockheed Martin will look at it as their opportunity to take people to space also, to space. Not that the government will pay for that as a contract, but that they will probably take that opportunity to do that. But the question then is if you have a vehicle there that's purely for lifeboat services and is rated for human beings coming down, but not up, because the launchers are not yet rated to carry them up, or there may not be an escape system, then when that vehicle's been there for, say, 6 months or 2 years, whatever the life of that vehicle is, we could get to that tourist model that the Russians have been thinking about for more than 5 years, whereby a descending lifeboat doesn't go straight to Earth, but it is joined up with a launched Earth departure stage on an expendable that docks with the descending lifeboat and is then boosted in a round-the-moon flight for 6 days before doing an Earth return from the moon into the Earth's atmosphere. The Soyuz was designed for this. And the Russians flew three Zond satellites back in the 70s, whereby using the thermal protection system of the Soyuz. If the Orion return vehicle had the thermal protection system on it that it was being designed to have to return from the moon, it could actually do a round-the-moon flight on the way back from serving its purpose as a lifeboat at the station. What I like about that possibility is the opportunity to start leaving low Earth orbit and going after the propellant farm ideas of using L1 as a transition point out of low Earth orbit beyond the moon. And it also allows us to offer a parallel path to the Russians to do something similar. So that in the end, having this capability to use the space station as a transportation node out of low Earth orbit to L1 and beyond would have some significant value, because we were building a redundant path if we could get our partners to do the same thing.
Tom, let's talk a little bit about conducting research on the station. You've had great dealings with NASA. It sounds like you don't need anything fixed in order to do business, but some have suggested maybe you have to set up some sort of nonprofit entity. I know that that's been talked about to sort of provide a channel between the researchers and NASA and the station. Is that necessary? Is that just an extra layer? Can you do business just fine as it is?
I think that when they were flying most of the science back in the early 2000s and late 1990s, they had a program where NASA took money from their budget and they put it through the Centers of Excellence. The Centers of Excellence then they submitted what they thought their research and best research to be proposed and accepted was. They had a review committee. The review committee went over that. The PIs were selected and the experiments were selected. And then they were put into a manifest that slipped a lot because they were constructing the station, admittedly. But they did fly eventually. How do I feel about that program? I guess is really where you have to begin the answer to what you were just asking. I've looked through all those experiments, and I saw kind of between the lines, when you start reading hundreds of these, you start reading into each one of these reports that's mandated by the NASA funding that the PIs have to provide. And so the reports kind of fit into this one format. And it's sort of a Cinderella's shoe kind of thing. You know, sometimes it doesn't fit, but they put it in there anyway. And but you get to where you get really good at kind of reading in between the lines. And then we did a lot of communications with the PIs that were then conducting the experiments back then, if it caught our interest, and we did a lot of that interplay as well. I think that it worked good at the time. I think that it probably could be improved upon. I don't like seeing NASA money that is being diverted through really a manned space flight, space hardware entity called NASA, and you're trying to go and put science up there. I really think that's the role of the NIH and the NSF, frankly.
I'd like to ask, you did mention, Tom, the other labs doing a lot of this stuff. I believe that's where a lot of the other traffic should come from, is from the other government labs.
I do too.
Well, how's that?
How do you think that could happen?
Is there a good
Money.
flow?
As I tell my kids, it's just money. You know.
And let me add to that, though, that when you get into a commercial module or model for providing services, crew as well as cargo, they're incentivized to go out to those other areas, those other agencies, and find customers. You are incentivized to go out and find customers. If we leave it up to NASA, they're not incentivized.
It's not their business.
It's not our business.
It's not their business. They did the best they could. I mean, every time anybody ever asks me what I think of NASA, I go, darn near get teary-eyed. I love them. What they do beautifully. And, well, it may cost more, or they made this or whatever. I don't care. The results are, we have a national laboratory that's floating around right now at 17,500 miles an hour at 220 miles up with 6 people in it, and they're living very comfortably, as you just saw. I mean, I don't care what kind of, criticism you can put on something. The results are always, if they're put in NASA's, their whole mentality and the whole kind of atmosphere that's at NASA is one for success, and they get the job done. But this isn't their job. This is what the NIH is supposed to do with their $20 billion that they get each year, and the NSF. And there's plenty of other things too. The Ag Department has research dollars as well. And there's lots of things that says that if you grow microbes up there, and my little microbes, or you can also grow things like algae. And you can find super algae and come back and find the genetics of how to replicate that, and you can create an algae that could go into a biofuel that could end up maybe changing the world. But you don't know that yet because the basic science hasn't been done. There's been theory, and there's been a few attempts to do that, but there's not anything that's been conclusive of it. So the answer to you is a nonprofit, we already have one. It's called the NIH. It's called the NSF. Do we want to create a new one? Well, maybe if you want to go get, the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation to go put money into something, maybe, or outside contributors, I guess so. If it's from the private sector, no one's ever tried to do that. So maybe.
But it's important to have that structure, you think, whatever it is, whether it's the NIH or.
For basic science, you bet. I don't think that you can get somebody who.
You can't get money for basic science, right?
It's not. It's too new.
Yeah.
And you know what? We're used to it. There's another thing there too, is we're used to it being, that the government pays for basic science.
Yeah. I just got the rap cue. Does anybody have a quick?
We've got an awesome audience. I mean, they're more qualified than we are. I want to hear what they think.
Just a little bit. Yeah, go ahead.
Well, okay. A quick question. You were talking about increasing access, and I saw on one of the slides, why don't we open to more international partners? You had the thing about the Indians,
and
the Chinese. I mean, obviously they got man-rated things, and why don't we get them involved?
Did I take that?
Yeah.
Yeah, please.
Somebody wants that question. I don't think that that's necessarily a bad thing, but that's a foreign policy issue, and that's not really about whether we have access to the station or not. That redundant access that Mike was talking about, we need 2 U.S. capabilities to get there. regardless of our international partners. That's what U.S. leadership and U.S. Independence in space really means. So we can invite partners in, or we cannot invite them in based on foreign policy, but having that access ourselves is good. And having this crew return module that we talked about was something that was planned originally on Space Station Freedom and ISS, and was canceled about 10 years ago. But it's a capability that also provides us that independence rather than relying on our foreign partners for it. So in developing the multiple commercial capabilities, NASA's put forward a $6.1 billion budget. That's a lot of money, but in terms of doing this, it's not a lot of money, and it's barely sufficient. We need to make sure that we don't piece part these things out so that we whittle those funds down to where we can't actually develop the capabilities. So as far as the crew rescue module or other science activities or other flagship missions, let's keep those budgets away and make sure that we have this program on solid footing to give us that independent access in space.
We're still over time, but we're going to go just a little bit longer, just because we got to hear from them just a little bit. Yeah.
Okay, just a
So
quick
we're on the interwebs. All right, go ahead.
question. I'm a professor up at Embry-Riddle, and a lot of my students are already.
State your name, so.
Jason Kring, and I'm a professor at Embry-Riddle Aeronautical University. We teach courses, and a lot of the students are already enthusiastic about space, but for the larger population, you see ISS as being a great opportunity to bring more of the general population in. Tom, the stuff you're talking about with the research there, that's fascinating, but I think a lot of times scientists are not good, and you're not one of the, I'm including in this group, that are not good about explaining what's really going on in a way that someone sitting at home can say, well, damn, that's exciting. So maybe it's quick points about how we can use ISS as a way to get the general population, and particularly students, to say, as you did, there's people living up in space right now, but we don't really think about it. It's another space flight mission, another shuttle mission. The general public, a lot of the people I talk to, it's just kind of like, well, we're going on up there. So thoughts on that?
I don't want to be the full answer on this, but I will tell you one thing, is it's an agency, NASA is, it's not a department. A department like the Army can pay for cars to go around a NASCAR track for 4.5 hours with their name on it. NASA cannot. So it can't pay for someone to go as an advertising agency to go out and exploit this. And they use their own engineers and their own scientists to do the best they can, and they do. They're just not trained to do that. And they don't have the budget, and nor does Congress give them the ability to pay for self-exploitation like I believe they should have. That's a cinch. They also, that, 10 or 20 million bucks a year, sure.
And all the astronauts do is we just saw.
They do the best they can. They're not trained to. You get a guy like Miles over here and put him in front of that, and
There you go. Send me up.
Tom,
Tom.
you'll get the hair on your back.
And let me just add one thing. When we have private companies able to put people in space, they'll be hiring people as astronauts and pilots, and they'll be advertising, and they'll be able to put the Coca-Cola logo, on what they're doing, and they'll be able to make, movies in space and all those other things that you're actually prohibited to have NASA employees doing on the space station. So having the private sector involved in a different way than it's been in the past opens up a whole bunch of possibilities.
Brings marketing with it. All right, I'm really way over time, but I'll tell you what, let's take one more. State your name quickly, and then we're going to, before I get in deep trouble.
From International Brotherhood of Electrical Workers. Under the current configuration, there's only like 2 PMAs on station currently right now, is that correct?
These are docking boards, right?
So if a CEV was to be attached, would that utilize one of those ports?
Not necessarily. We could use the CBMs.
Okay. So you could add some configuration change to allow for other people to come in on the
Yes.
Tappers?
Common berthing mechanism, by the way.
Send up on the expendables?
Well, right now, HTV, the Japanese module and the Japanese module comes up to station and is berthed. What that means is grabbed with an arm and put onto what would normally be another module's port, common berthing mechanism built by Boeing. And it is not a docking system. It's not one a spacecraft can just fly into. And that's one way for a vehicle to come to the station. It's not the way you'd bring crew to the station, because it's too dependent on the arm that's bringing you in. But it is definitely a way you can leave the station. So those ports for a lifeboat, so the lifeboat plan could use the CBM as a port, I believe.
All right, I'm sorry we got to end it. I wish we could take a few more questions, but thank you very much for your time. Thanks for being here, and really interesting discussion. Thank you all. Appreciate it.